Hey nerds, what's up? Today I want to talk about some other fantasy or fantasy adjacent media besides just books, which is what I normally talk about on this channel. My thought process being, if you like a lot of the fantasy book recommendations or discussions that I do on this channel, you might like some of the other things that I like. It also gives me a chance to talk about some of my favorites in a way I normally don't get to on this channel. Now, to be clear, I'm not expecting any of these recommendations to exactly be a revelation. I'm not someone who's like super good at finding the little unknown indie thing, and if I do, it's usually just completely by accident that I get on the bandwagon early. So you'll probably have heard of a lot of these things I'm recommending, but I'm hoping that if you haven't participated in any of them, I can be the one to push you over the edge. So today I'm going to recommend a podcast, a video game, a TV show, a hobby, and a board game. Let's get into it. My first recommendation is the Adventure Zone podcast. Now, I am not a podcast listener. I'll be perfectly honest. I've dabbled in a couple podcasts, but this is really the one that's kept me coming back over and over again. The Adventure Zone is a real play comedy Dungeons and Dragons podcast run by a family, three brothers, Griffin, Justin, and Travis McElroy, and their dad, Clint McElroy. Now, the McElroys you may know from other famous ventures. For example, two of the brothers are the people who started Polygon, or they also have a very other famous podcast, Mim Bam, which I have mentioned before on my Instagram, my brother, and me. Now, this was just an experimental podcast they did, and people fell in love with it, and so it's still going today. I have listened to this podcast an embarrassing number of times. Like, I listen to it over and over and over again. I actually consider it to be one of the most influential pieces of media for me, not in terms of like living my life, but as a favorite piece of media that I have ever experienced. Everyone I know who has listened to the thing in its entirety have all cried at the end of it, which is very funny when you first start listening to it, because you'd be like, how would anyone cry at this podcast? But some of the things I love about it is that A, it's extremely funny, B, I love the family dynamics it brings. I obviously love Dungeons and Dragons, but also the story it weaves is so intricate and ends up being this like mystery where you can solve things and go back and see all the hints and clues. And it reminds me of Sanderson in the way that everything ends up just falling into puzzle pieces just perfectly. And it might not be as clean as a novel because Dungeons and Dragons, by definition, is collaborative storytelling, so everyone worked together. But the way it just ended up working out was just incredible. This is like my comfort podcast. Whenever I'm feeling really bad anxiety or I can't sleep at night, this is what I listen to again, and I inevitably always listen through all of the episodes because I just love the story it tells so much. Now, a few things. First, you do not have to have played or know anything about Dungeons and Dragons to enjoy this podcast, I promise. It's really mostly collaborative storytelling. And don't get overwhelmed when you see how many episodes there are. These are what we'd call story arcs. I am specifically recommending the first story arc, which is Balance, which was told in about 70 episodes. That's all the first one that I'm recommending you listen to. So you want to go back to episode 1. You will notice there are 2 episode 1s. Here's my recommendation. If you love and know and play Dungeons and Dragons, I would listen to the uncut version because it has a lot of play rules and things discussed I think are interesting to people who play Dungeons and Dragons. If you don't play, I would play the 1.5 episode, which is a cut version that kind of takes all of those nitty-gritty details out, and I think is a lot easier to follow if you're not a Dungeons and Dragons player. Either way, I hope you try this podcast out. I am absolutely in love with it, and I think a lot of you would enjoy it too. Okay, number 2 is a video game recommendation. Now, usually my video game type is expansive worlds, single player, the kind of thing that I can just get lost in for hours and hours and hours and usually be a completionist about. You know, from my favorite games as a kid, which were like Mario 64 and Paper Mario, to my adult favorites like Dragon Age Inquisition and Skyrim and Breath of the Wild. So the game I'm recommending today is actually quite different from those, and it is Undertale. Now, Undertale is an award-winning video game. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it, but let me tell you, was a revelation when I played it. It was gifted to me by my brother-in-law, and I knew nothing about it going in, which, by the way, I think is the correct way to go into it, and was blown away. It's interesting, this is a game that is very simple, right? The gameplay is extremely simple, it is straightforward, but it packs such an emotional punch in the story it is trying to tell. And as I went in blind, I didn't kind of figure out the thing till about halfway through playing the game. And to say that I was floored when I started figuring out is an understatement. This kind of became an obsession for me for a little bit. I immediately played Undertale again right away. Like I've never played a video game back to back like that immediately once I finished. This game is unique. It has an emotional impact. It has great music, great characters, and it's also a very simple play game. So I think it's very accessible to all levels and all types of people who enjoy video games. So if you need something kind of short, it's a game that's on the shorter side, something really entertaining and will pack a punch and is very different probably than other things you've played, I highly, highly recommend Undertale. Number 3 is a TV show, and this one's more fantasy adjacent, I guess I would say, but it is what I consider to be my favorite TV show of all time, and that is Community, created by Dan Harmon. Community is a comedy show about a group of people going to community college, and it just has so many hilarious references in it. It is just my kind of humor, but it references a lot of pop culture and things like Dungeons and Dragons and even famous documentaries and famous movies. It's just kind of nerd culture, I would say, adjacent, and never fails to make me laugh. I have rewatched the show so many times and I absolutely love it. My recommendation are the first 3 seasons. It gets a little dicey in season 4, season 5's okay, season 6 a little dicey, but the first 3 seasons are incredible. And if you haven't watched the show and you like referential things and are kind of in the fantasy community or nerd community, highly, highly recommend the show. You need to start from the beginning to understand all the characters. Number 4 is a hobby, and I don't think it's gonna surprise anyone that I am recommending you play Dungeons and Dragons. I absolutely love Dungeons and Dragons. I've been playing for about 6 years now, and I think people feel like Dungeons and Dragons is like their last hurdle to fully being immersed in just like no going back in nerd culture. And it has gained a lot of popularity. I think Stranger Things was one thing that like really upped it in popularity, and it's just kind of more in pop culture. I just think pretty much everyone can enjoy Dungeons and Dragons. I think it feels like a lot to get into, but once you're into it, you'll enjoy it. We actually kind of did a test, me and my husband. We invited a bunch of friends over multiple weeks where we did one-shots, basically just a single night of Dungeons and Dragons to give people a taste of it. Every single person said they wanted to play again. And these are not people necessarily like super immersed in nerd culture. Dungeons & Dragons is basically a board game in the theater of your mind, and it enjoys role-playing and collaborative storytelling. And it's a great way if you love fantasy and wish you could write fantasy, but don't have the skill or time to write a whole novel. You can get some of those feelings out in small ways through Dungeons & Dragons, where you're helping write a character and write a story and write emotional beats. Another thing I love about Dungeons & Dragons is it forges really good friendships. The people we started playing with, we knew, but some of them we didn't know super well. They are now some of our closest friends. There is something about having a set time, 2 times a month, to get together with the same group of people and to really share yourself by role-playing and making jokes and working together that forge friendships. And that's one of my favorite parts of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, if you want to get started and you don't know how, I have some recommendations. First, if you've never played and you want to play, I recommend listening maybe to some D&D podcasts to get an idea of gameplay. Now, I've already mentioned the Adventure Zone, but another very famous one is Critical Role, or another one that I enjoy that's more comedy is Dungeons and Daddies, which is a hilarious podcast, but there's tons of them that might give you an idea of gameplay if you've never played. And then I say be brave, buy the DM's handbook, give it a read, invite some people who are willing to learn with you, and play. You can't really play Dungeons and Dragons wrong, and learning together is a great way to start. You do not need to be a pro to start your own group. That's what we did. My husband had only played a single campaign. None of the rest of us had really played. He just started with our group of friends, and we are still playing 6 years later. If that's a little too scary for you, there are also ways to join groups on Steam or Roll20 through the internet. You can find groups on Reddit or other communities who will accept new players. You can also find board game stores in your local area. They usually have nights where you can join a Dungeons and Dragons group and kind of give it an idea of how to play. So there's a lot of accessible ways for you to try. I highly recommend, if you just have wanted to get into it and haven't known how, to seek it out. One of my favorite hobbies I have. And finally, last but not least, I want to recommend a board game. And the board game I'm going to recommend today is Arcadia Quest. Now, Arcadia Quest I love because it's a little bit more involved of a board game. It kind of threads the needle of a typical board game that you play in one session in one evening, and the legacy board games, which you permanently change and play over multiple sessions. Arcadia Quest is a game that you play over multiple sessions, but you don't permanently change, so you can keep playing it over and over again. Basically, in Arcadia Quest, you are against other players as you try to accomplish quests and earn money and buy upgrades for yourself. It is very role-playing adjacent and also just fantasy adjacent. It is a more complicated board game, which I think is very fun for board gamers. I love the pieces. I think the art is really fun and cool. And it's just a game we have played over and over again, especially with my son, who is obsessed with this game. And you can play it in a lot of different varieties, so I feel like it doesn't get old. And I do love playing games where I can sit down with the same group of people over multiple nights and really feel like you're building something out. Now, I will say, if you're competitive, Arcadia Quest will make you angry. It's me. I get angry a lot during this game, but ultimately I love this. And if you're looking for a new board game to try that's just a little more involved and allows you to play multiple times with the same people, highly recommend this one. Okay, those are my 5 fantasy or fantasy adjacent recommendations for you today. If you're looking for something new, either to play or to watch or to experience, if you have experienced any of these, please tell me what you thought of them in the comments below. Or if you go and try them, please let me know, as these are some of my favorites and my favorite thing to talk about. Also, you can leave recommendations for me in any of these 5 categories. Tell me what I need to get into. As always, if you like these kind of videos, the best way to support me is to like and subscribe. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.